Jeremy is a colleague of mine. He's the Asia Literary Editor at The Workshop. He edits the Trans-Pacific Literary Project. And he is a talented writer outside of all the amazing work he does with us. He has a lot of praise from Singapore, actually, I want to read. Esquire magazine in Singapore wrote, "No obstacle will hinder the release of Jeremy Tiang's debut novel." And the reason we're doing the event tonight, actually, is that the book came out in Singapore in July, but now it's just now become available in the UK and the US through Epigram Books. The book was a finalist for the 2016 Epigram Books Fiction Prize, which honors the best Singaporean novel. Jeremy is also the author of the short story collection It Never Rains on National Day, which was shortlisted for the Singapore Literature Prize. He also writes and translates plays and has translated more than 10 books from Chinese. He's been awarded a Penn Heim Grant, an NEA Fellowship, and a Henry Luce Foundation Fellowship. And then our other reader for tonight is Yu-Mei Balasingamchow. She's the co-author of Singapore, a Biography, and the co-editor of the literary collection In Transit, an anthology from Singapore on airports and air travel. Her short fiction has been shortlisted for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize and published in the US, UK, and Singapore. In 2015, she was an honorary fellow in writing at the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. And this year, in 2017, she's the writer in residence at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. She lives in Singapore and is currently working on a novel. We'll start off with a historical reading from Jeremy and then Yu-Mei, and they'll discuss sort of the historical context of their work in the 1950s in Singapore. And then after that, Jeremy will do a more contemporary reading, and then we'll have a Q&A and take questions from the audience. So thanks again so much for coming, and congratulations to Jeremy.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. The novel spans from the 1950s to the present day, and as Sophia says, this section is going to be from the earliest chronological bit of the novel, the 1950s, when 15-year-old schoolgirl Siu Li is caught up in the socialist fervor sweeping the Chinese schools of Singapore. Already, amongst her comrades, there was a sense of having missed out on the headiest times. If they'd been a decade older, they would have joined Force 136 or the MPAJA, the guerrilla resistance against the Japanese. They would have gone to China to be part of the struggle and shared in the glory of 1949. Things seemed grubbier now, less clear. It was easy to sit in a stadium as some firebrand flung strong words about and to feel righteous and cleansed. But what good did that actually do? She listened to Lim Chin Siong, so stirring and strong. He'd been expelled for the exam boycott he organized. Sitting there in her school uniform, Siu Li felt indicted, as if she'd never taken a real risk. They were under a state of emergency, and the National Service Act had been put in place just a couple of years ago to co-opt their young men into fighting their brothers and sisters. With all this happening, how had she ever thought it was all right to be passive? Now she was listening for it. She could hear there was also something in the air, the possibility that this was a crucible, that everything the nation could become was right here in this moment. Lena was right. War had leveled everything, and here was a chance to blaze through the world and make it fair again. So much of this was obvious. Of course workers ought to own the means of production. Of course it was wrong that the people who did the actual labor were least likely to enjoy the fruits. She understood now that her life had been an exercise in false consciousness. When her mum told her to be grateful for what they had, she now knew this to be propaganda spread by the ruling classes to keep the masses down. What was gratitude but complacency and quiescence? It was imperative to demand more. She started writing pamphlets. So much of what she read was from China, and society here was different. Using local examples would surely do more to convince the Malayan people of these ideas. The things she said seemed obvious to her, and it was always startling how strongly her comrades responded. She could never put her name to these essays, which had to be copied and distributed in secret. But it was still amazing to think of her words spreading like that. During their June holidays that year, she convinced the rest of the leadership to try the life of a worker. Didn't they want to experience the dignity of labor for themselves? How else could they truly understand the conditions they were striving to improve? Besides, they needed to be humble, otherwise there would be nothing setting them apart from the English school elites. She'd read Animal Farm and knew the main thing in any movement was not to turn into the pigs. She and a few others got jobs at a construction site by the simple expedient of lying about their ages. The supervisor didn't care as long as they got the job done. It was shockingly simple, no thought at all required. Just do as you're told, move the bricks from this pile over there, mix this batch of mortar quickly and get it to the bricklayers before it starts to set. The girls were expected to work as hard as the boys, which Sully approved of, even if by the end of the first day she felt like her arms would never stop hurting. And what glory there was in good, honest work. She came home each day exhausted and sunburnt, her mother hovering anxiously and offering to just give her the money. But of course the wages were hardly the point. In fact, they came to almost nothing, just a few coins at the end of each shift. The iced drink vendors at the end of the lane were irresistible after so much thirsty work, and Sully ended up handing over her hard-earned cash for a clear plastic bag of Pepsi Cola, invigorated and refreshed by the cool, dark fluid. "You're spoilt," she told herself sternly. If the real workers could see how frivolously she threw around her day's earnings, what would they think? Yet by the time school started again, she had to guiltily admit that she'd spent every cent she'd earned, and there was nothing left at all. Thank you.
Hello. My work's different from Jeremy's. I'm writing fiction now, but the book I'm going to read from is Singapore Biography, which is non-fiction. It's a history of Singapore that I co-authored with Mark Ravinder Frost. It came out in 2009, I think. And it covers Singapore history from 700 years ago, the Malay Temasek period, and it stops around the 1970s. The bit I'm going to read is about the political climate of the 1950s, complementary to the part that Jeremy just covered from his novel. And I'm going to read about two particular historical figures, Lim Chin Siong and Fong Swee Suan. And they were both at the time young men in their 20s, student leaders. They later became trade union leaders. They were involved in the leftist movement. Both were detained without trial by the current government. Lee Kuan Yew's government. Mr. Lee is no longer current, sorry. Well, the PAP government. They were both detained, without trial for some time later, and then basically were released on the condition that they no longer participate in politics. That happens much later in adult life. At this point in the 1950s, they're in their 20s. Back in the 1950s, people's first impressions of Lim Chin Siong and Fong Swee Suan were invariably the same: serious, charismatic, and in Lim's case, especially if you were, as Lee Kuan Yew remembered, one of those girls in the trade unions, very attractive. Lim, the more dominant of the two, often instilled in new acquaintances a sense that he was possessed of supreme gravitas. Dennis Bloodworth, the Singapore correspondent for the British Observer newspaper, wrote of his knack at staring fixedly into a speaker's eyes after he had stopped speaking, and letting the silence drag out dangerously before he caught his breath and broke it himself. In Bloodworth's eyes, this was an old Chinese debating trick, one of several that Lim seemed to have tucked away as one of Singapore's greatest political orators, the man that Lee Kuan Yew described as having a soft baby face, but a ringing voice that flowed in his native Hokkien. Nor was Lim, in particular, above resorting to provocative soundbites or populist posturing. During a speech against the registration of Chinese youth under the proposed National Service Bill in 1954, he famously observed, "Look, friends, only dogs have licenses and numbers." He told another adoring crowd, "The British say you cannot stand on your own 2 feet. Show them that you can stand. at which point, according to one eyewitness, 40,000 people leapt up, shining with sweat, fists in the air, shouting, Merdeka, which means freedom. Both Lim and Fong had what is called the common touch, and they were careful to nurture it. Among Singapore's new political leaders of the time, they were probably the only ones who traveled everywhere by bicycle and who slept on their desks at their Middle Road shophouse headquarters, just like their supporters. But to really get inside the minds of these two men, we have to understand where they came from. To be Chinese-speaking or Chinese-educated in early 1950s Singapore was to belong to a marginalized majority that had yet to see much improvement in its prospects. Job opportunities remained poor, Chinese schools were underfunded, crowded, and neglected, and the qualifications that they provided frequently went unrecognized. Further Chinese education after secondary school involved leaving Singapore for China, a prospect which became increasingly difficult following the country's communist revolution of 1949. Meanwhile, the rise of Malay nationalism across the causeway with its emphasis on Malay as the sole national language brought a sense of foreboding that Chinese culture as a whole was under threat. As Fong Swee Swan recalled, when in 1950 he and Lim were both pupils at Chinese high school, their shared intellectual curiosity was what brought them together. Lim and Fong appeared to have read everything and anything, from Russian classics to Victorian fiction to Western and deeply critical accounts of communism, all of which had become available in Chinese translation. And in addition to world literature, there were new world events to digest. For the vast majority of Chinese in Singapore, China's 1949 Communist Revolution was greeted as a victory of the people against evil landlords and greedy merchants, and thus a source of great national pride. To Fong, local Chinese interest in the political system in China was therefore natural. Both he and Lim admired Mao Zedong, as did most of their generation. The 1949 revolution was the culmination, as Lim saw it, of a very exciting period throughout Afro-Asia and Latin America. The success of the socialist movement at that time came as a great encouragement and excitement to us. Finally, to have received any education at all was then regarded in a Chinese context as a great privilege, one that students such as Lim and Fong felt that they were obliged to repay by serving as community leaders. By 1952, both men had been forced to leave Chinese High because of their anti-British sentiments, Lim for his involvement with the Anti-British League, and they had taken up jobs as bus workers. Within 2 years, they had emerged as strident union leaders, partly through their ability to read and write, but equally because of their sheer commitment and charisma. Okay, so to get things started, we're focusing tonight very much on Jeremy's novel, and perhaps I will begin with, where did the novel begin? How did you get the idea for this, and what compelled you to pick up a rather complicated but important narrative?
Well, I suppose as the cliche goes, you write the book that you want to see in the world. And I wasn't seeing this novel. I'd seen books from older writers dealing with the 1950s leftist movements, but nothing more recently, and nothing really drawing a continuum of the communist struggle in early Singapore, which, after all, the state of emergency against the communists in Malaya went from 1948 to 1960, but the actual communist struggle continued until 1989, which is comfortably within my lifetime. And yet, this was largely undiscussed in Singaporean literature, at least in the English language. So I wanted to write a book that talked about that, and that talked about the history of detention without trial in Singapore, and about political dissidents, which are topics that don't come up a great deal.
Well, you mentioned that the topic has not been discussed that much in English writing, but then in Chinese writing it has, right? I mean,
Yes. I mean, for those of you who don't know, there are 4 main languages in Singapore: English, Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. I can't speak for Malay and Tamil because not a huge amount of the literature has been translated. But I read Chinese, in fact, I translate from Chinese and have translated books on the subject. And a big influence on me was the writer Yu-Mei Balasingamchow, whose novels, including Unrest, deal explicitly with the marginalized in Singapore, the Chinese educated who were pushed to the margins by the English educated mainstream, and the leftists who were displaced by capitalism and the rightward drift of Singapore. So there has been conversation around this, but there's also amnesia. And I think a great deal of younger Singaporeans particularly aren't that aware of this stretch of history. You know, there was the Japanese occupation during World War II, and there was independence in 1965. But what happened in between, including the moment where Singapore looked like it was on the balance between left and right, is largely undiscussed, and I think many people would prefer to forget it existed at all, which for a writer is a really fertile ground to probe into and say, well, what's here that's not being talked about, and what are the stories that aren't being heard?
Okay, so maybe let's talk about that for a while. You just said that period, because it's not widely discussed in history books. Certainly, it's not something you study to great depth in school unless you do advanced studies. Your work is fiction, but to what extent does it draw on historical accounts, and what kind of research did you do to get into the head of someone like Siu Li, you know, in the 1950s, a student thinking about all these ideologies, competing ideologies?
Well, the good thing about writing a historical novel set in the relatively recent past, the 1950s and 60s up to the present day, is that most of the principles are still alive. So I was able to simply ask a lot of people who had participated in this movement, and I also relied on the oral histories at the Singapore National Archives, which are actually quite a good documentation of the time. And I should say that YuMei's book was a great source for me, because it is an even-handed treatment of the time, I think, in contrast to, well, the propensity in Singapore, because a single party has been in power for more than 50 years, to streamline dissenting voices into an official narrative and presenting events from the past only through one lens. So, sorry, I should just say that I also traveled up to Malaysia, where, well, actually they're in Thailand now. The former communists are still holed up, basically in exile in these small villages on the Thai-Malaysia border. And they're really happy to tell you about everything that happened during the struggle, because no one ever asks.
Yeah, just backtracking a bit to what you said about how, because one government has been in power for 54 years, actually no longer, 58 years, since 59, yeah, really. So, you know, 59, yeah, no, very important, sorry, a few days mixed up, 58 years, yeah. And the idea of streamlining into one official narrative. And I think what's interesting, I mean, this also came up when I was doing historical research, not just of this period, but periods that are very sort of set in stone in the way we talk about them, like the Japanese occupation of Singapore, or even certain ways in which the British colonial powers are remembered for a benign colonialism in Singapore. Now, when we look back at history, we tend to look at these things as, oh yeah, it was inevitable. You know, the Japanese would be defeated and the British would come back at the end of 1945. Or, oh yeah, it was inevitable. Lee Kuan Yew and his political party would be strong and become the leaders. You know, they were the winning power. But if you were actually a person alive at the time and politics is in play and different things are happening and you don't know who's going to win the ongoing political battle, yeah, it's a very uncertain time. The choices you make seem very innocuous, but then you might get swept up on the wrong side of history for a very small, perhaps even apolitical choice, not even necessarily a political one, which is I mean, something I think that we forget after a certain distance from the historical event. And I was wondering whether, because you have a variety of characters who are caught up in different historical events. A few of your characters make deliberate political choices, others just happen to be there, right? I don't know if you could talk a bit more about that.
So the novel is narrated by 6 different characters, partly because it spans such a long amount of time that I wanted different voices in different decades, and partly because the perspectives were very different depending on whether you were Chinese educated or English educated, Chinese, Malay, or Indian, or another ethnicity, whether you were Singaporean or Malaysian. And it felt important to capture all of this and to try and present something that was approaching well-rounded. I wouldn't want to say I've captured the entirety of the issue, because that would be impossible, but to present at least multiple points of view. I think the danger of Singapore being a relatively small place with a relatively controlled media and state education system is that, not even out of malice, but just for lack of platforms, we don't really hear voices other than the official ones. And so other viewpoints just wither, other perspectives on past events just die away almost naturally, because we become so accustomed to deferring to the official version. And so I really wanted to revive a lot of these, what are known by the Singapore government as revisionist narratives, and examine them. I don't necessarily agree with everything, but they are valid viewpoints that are held or have been held by people who were alive at the time. And I wanted to present them alongside each other, with these different voices saying, this is what I think happened, and someone else says, no, well, this is how I remember it. And that way, maybe we get a bit closer to the truth of what did go on all that time ago.
Okay, do you want to move to the present and read us the next bit?
Okay, yes. Right, so I'll read a short section from the present day section of the novel, in which, and this is an actual thing that happens, the old left of Singapore get together once a year to have lunch. And because they're it's Chinese New Year, yes, the 3rd day, I think. And they're the only ones who still remember and talk about these days. And it's lovely and also really terrible that...
Yeah, I mean, you have to imagine this is a group of people in their 70s, 80s, who, when they were young people, like Mr. Lim and Mr. Fong, who I read about, or like the character of Siu Li, were involved in various kinds of political activities. And then because of the way political repression or other things have gone on in Singapore, I mean, we have become marginalized and also have aged naturally. And are probably just not used to people even asking them about the past and what they did when they were, 20-year-olds and so on. But every year on Chinese New Year, they get together for lunch and talk about the old days, among other things.
Singapore's kind of an extreme version of history is written by the victors, in that the people who lose don't just not get to tell their stories, but they're completely erased from the narrative. And that's how they end up at least trying to remind each other that, yes, this happened, and yes, we lived through it. But they're so far outside the mainstream that, again, it felt important to honor their voices and at least throw a bit of light on them. Stella has saved them seats at one of the far tables. She introduces the others, whom she seems familiar with. This is Gyok Leong. She was quite senior in the General Labour Union. This is Halim. He's a historian these days. Wrote a book recently about the movement. You might remember it. And over there, that's Ng Lei Kwan. Maybe you remember her? She was an MP very briefly in the 60s, before your time, of course. Never got to take her seat. The old leftists, she explained, meets for lunch once a year. She only found out about this a few years ago, and now she joins them regularly. When Henry continues to look bemused, she shrugs. Sure, I guess it must seem a bit strange to you. I first heard about it a few years ago and thought I'd see what it's like. Do they mind outsiders joining? Don't be silly. Anyway, you're not an outsider. You have family connections. And indeed, he is surprised by the outpouring when Stella mentions who his mother is. Le Kuan embraces him and says Siu Li was one of the best ones they had. Such a shame. He braces himself, but their stories are sweet and not particularly revelatory. He already has all this information about her work with the unions, her detention. As for what happened after her disappearance, there is nothing. These people weren't in contact with her any more than he was. Everyone is keen to chat as the food starts to arrive, course after course. There's lots of gossip, rehashing of old episodes, catching up on each other's latest ailments. Revathi is beaming. There's an article in this, he can see her thinking. Henry catches up with Stella's life. She's still making ends meet, giving tuition, not doing much else. Harlem asks Henry if he's still angry with the government for what it did. I haven't really thought about that in a while. It's all in the past. The ISA is still around today. Well, they say they only detain terrorists, though. They called us terrorists, you know. If there's no trial, no need to produce evidence. You can call people anything you want. Your ma was right to go, says Lei Kuan, suddenly looking fierce. Otherwise, locked up like us, no chance. Some people are still outside, can't come back. How can you say everything is in the past when there are still people trapped outside? You mustn't blame your ma, whatever you do. He can only nod, and is fortunately saved from having to reply as the performances start just then. A trio of erhus drone out a melancholy tune, then someone does card tricks. There are some songs, and a skit from the old days. Something about a girl almost betraying her village, but coming to her senses just in time. Next are the speeches, some in English in deference to the few non-Chinese comrades, the rest in Mandarin. Henry finds he understands enough of the language to keep up a whispered commentary to Revathi. Not much of what they're saying is important anyway. This has the feel of ritual, of words being spoken, not only because they are true, but to keep them from being forgotten.
Okay, no, sorry, we were debating what to where to move the conversation. I guess as I was listening to Jeremy's reading, I was thinking about the fact that this scene actually sort of ties together a lot of different elements of the state of emergency that the title of his work refers to. And so you have the reference to his mother, Siu Li, his characters, Henry's mother, not Jeremy's mother. Sorry, this is not autobiography, I can verify that. To the character Henry's mother, Siu Li, who was the young woman in the previous reading, and at this point, they're all referring to it as your ma, like what she did for the movement. And then it also has the old leftists, and then they're talking about the ISA. The ISA is the Internal Security Act in Singapore, which is a holdover from British times, which basically allows the government to detain someone without charges or trial for as long as they like. The longest political prisoner was for 23 years, Mr. Chia Taipo. But many others have been held for shorter periods as well. And many people who were involved in leftist movements at varying degrees were detained for anything from like 1 month to 5 years to, a long time. So that's sort of what the characters were referring to. And it does make, like listening to him read that does make me feel like, oh gosh, we are living with the burden of so many of these things, and yet they are often not spoken of in public or, in wider discourse.
Yeah, I mean, Singapore is a lot like the Ursula K. Le Guin story, where a child is locked up and tortured so that the rest of society can live in peace and plenty, and everyone just gets very good at not thinking about the tortured child. I should read the epigraph of the book because I think it explains where I'm coming from. It's a quote from Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history. The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. And I think that's something that feels very current to a lot of us, where life, particularly political life, just seems to be a lurching from crisis to crisis. And there's always some reason to justify repression. It's very seductive to be told, we're keeping you safe. And that's what happens through the decades of this novel. Every single act of imprisonment, of detention, of exile is explained by we're keeping you safe. And I think there can come a point where you have to question, safe from what? And what's left of life if we're so afraid of everything?
Okay, so maybe stepping away from that for a minute, to come back to your earlier point about telling the story from multiple perspectives. And many of the characters, so there are 6 characters whose perspectives tell you the story. Several of them are related, family members, but there are 2 in particular that are not. But they're also participants in what was going on at the time. One is a man named Nam Tek, who is living in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia and eventually gets involved with the communists fighting in the jungle against the British. And the other is a character, Ravati, who appeared in the short bit he just read. She's a journalist from London who comes to Malaysia at some point and eventually kind of comes back. What made you bring in these additional characters beyond the immediate family story? I mean, what were you trying to do in terms of sort of enlarging the voices?
Well, I wanted it to be more than just one family story. I wanted a broader canvas, and the easiest way to do that was to bring in these external viewpoints. Namtik is included because I particularly wanted to touch on the Batang Kali massacre, which has been referred to as Malaysia's My Lai. Essentially, or maybe it should be Britain's My Lai. But British soldiers basically massacred an entire village or all the men in the village, 23 of them in cold blood, alleging that they were communists. And at the time, that's all you needed to say. So over the decades, the survivors didn't let it go, and they kept taking it to the British High Court, and successive British governments have just shut down the inquiries. So at this point, the British establishment has more or less taken the position of, all right, yes, that happened, but it was such a long time ago. And so no one's ever been held culpable for this. An entire village massacred. So that's something I wanted to talk about because a lot of people today, both in Singapore and Malaysia and in the UK, are unaware that this happened. So it seems imperative to remind everyone at every opportunity. And Revathi came in a similar vein because you can't really talk about the history of Singapore without talking about colonialism. And so I wanted there to be a British perspective. To start off with, Revathi the character was actually a white British woman based on the historian Mary Turnbull. But the more I wrote, the more unsatisfactory I found that. And so I arrived at the solution of making her parents Singaporean. And then it came very easily. Someone who has a connection to Singapore but is also British. And an Indian Singaporean who is outside of the Chinese-English dichotomy, is able to see things with a certain amount of clarity. So that brought many valuable points of view that I wasn't able to get elsewhere in the novel. And I think the character of Revathi functions as a kind of truth teller. She's the one who goes from Britain back to Malaysia and digs till she uncovers evidence of what happened at Batang Kali and of the killing that took place there. And then she fails to get justice because historically justice has not been served, and I didn't want to go too far into wishful thinking. But for a moment, we can at least be with her and enjoy the triumph of knowing for sure that this is what happened, even if the British government won't acknowledge it.
Okay, on that note, maybe should we open up to questions from the floor now? Yeah.
Hi, thank you guys so much for talking. I absolutely love the selections from your books and the conversation. I've been someone who's gone to Singapore many times. I have a lot of friends there. I think one of the biggest things when I talk to them about politics is there's a certain sort of resignation they have, a certain sort of hopelessness where they say, yeah, we had these big time leftist leaders like Lim Chin Siong and like JBJ Ratnam, but the problem is we don't have that now. And so there's a sort of pessimism about the future of a liberal or a progressive or a socialist left in Singapore. And I wanted to gauge how you guys feel about that, because we talk so much about history, but we often forget sometimes history can kind of inform us where are we going, and is this something that's going to slowly peter out, or is this something that's kind of bubbling up, so it's going to percolate into something bigger where there are going to be movements saying we're done with the PAP, let's look at something new. Thank you.
Well, one of the reasons one of the reasons I wrote this novel was to challenge an assumption that things have always been like this. As you say, there's a resignation, but there's also a forgetting that we did have a past when dissent was possible, when elections were held and we didn't know the outcome ahead of time. A lot of the hopelessness in Singapore now is that we have regular democratic elections. They just happen to all be won by the same party because they hold all the levers of power. And when you control the media and education and basically everything, it's very difficult for anyone else to get a word in. So I'm sort of neutral. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I just want to note that historically, there was a time when Singaporeans rose up and demanded better. And I think it could happen again. It could. Whether it will, well, that's up to us.
I was just going to add that also, from talking to a lot of my friends who are involved in political activism in Singapore, that especially today with social media and all this sort of constant barrage of information, we think change happens overnight, but change takes a long time sometimes. And being an activist, the ones who stay the course and, you kind of know, maybe even in my lifetime, I will not see the change, but I need to say something about this injustice or this, unfair way of, or illegal or illegitimate, whatever mode. And I just need to make that statement, whether I'm writing a memoir or, putting, and that action is important, even though you don't see immediate change, And I think that's what also a lot of Singaporeans don't have the patience for, because we live in a fast pace. Singapore is very fast paced. We are inundated with digital media. And we have forgotten this history of 1950s, 1960s activism, which was terribly slow motion when you think about it. I mean, what they didn't have, not everyone had even a telephone in their own home, so that slow pace of change, it must have felt to them then, and even yet they were doing the things they did, and now we just have to keep doing them,
Hi, thank you both for coming and speaking about your work. So Jeremy, I was very sort of compelled by the way you talked about how in your book you felt the need to talk about British colonialism. And my question chiefly is, do you think Singapore can or will ever get over its colonial hangover, given that it's very much a neo-colonial society? Like in recent days, Prince Charles and Camilla have visited Singapore, and just looking at the discussion online and also the way President Halimah Yacob has sort of talked about British colonialism of Singapore as bilateral ties and all these sorts of euphemisms, do you think that Singapore will ever sort of get to a point where we can sort of look at the colonial period in even an even-handed way and think about what impact that has had on us without sort of just continuing on this new colonial path uncritically?
I hope so, but honestly, probably not anytime soon. As you say, Singapore has bought the colonial myth hook, line, and sinker. And the predominant attitude in Singapore towards colonialism is gratitude, which is upsetting to some of us. But when colonialism has so successfully been incorporated into the single narrative that we were talking about, it's very hard to reverse course when we're brought up believing in the benevolence of the British. And we go around speaking English, and we're brought up reading Enid Blyton and Thomas Hardy. And we still have a largely British education system, and people then go on to university in England as a matter of course. It's hard to break out of that. It took me a long time to break out of that, because you don't question what you're told is the truth and present it as objective truth until you're given some kind of outside voice that maybe tickles something in you and says, oh, maybe that's more how things were. Maybe it was an extractive economy. Maybe they were largely exploiting us. And I would love to see that becoming more widespread. But again, it's not something that gets discussed much in Singapore, where there are statues of white men everywhere, and streets are named after them. And a lot of people, including my parents, have a lot of nostalgia for that period. And my dad is very proud that he speaks the Queen's English. All of that. I don't know that it will change soon, but I hope it does eventually go away.
Any questions?
Congratulations, Jeremy, on your book. Your first book was, of course, a collection of short stories, and this new book is a novel. What would you say is your greatest challenge in writing a novel, having written so many short stories before, and how did you find a way to overcome that challenge?
Oh, well, I mean, I totally cheated by having 6 separate narrators. So it's basically 6 longish short stories joined together. So that was my easy way in. But I suppose the challenge was thinking in a sustained way, but that's always going to be the challenge when covering such a long period of history. And I just had to give myself a lot of roadmaps, reminding myself who knew what when. As YuMei says, when you're actually living in a time and you don't know what's coming next, you perceive it very differently to the way you do after the event. And I had to constantly remind myself that these people didn't know what was coming next, even if it seemed obvious to me, it wasn't to them. So just sustaining that and keeping that going for the entire length, keeping the history fresh and experiencing it myself as if for the first time in order to replicate what the characters were going through.
Hi, I just have a little query about your research process in general. Like, I was wondering, because there is a small pocket in the ecology of the Singapore arts scene, particular, I guess, in the theater scene I'm thinking of like TNS's, Harishama's, Manifesto, Gemuk Girls, that all in a sense touch, or even Jason Su's Untracing the Conspiracy. And so I'm just wondering, to what extent were these informative or generative for you, rather than just relying on, for example, interviews and secondary sources from academia? Did these other artistic responses from plays, films, documentaries have any resonances with you? Did it inform your research process, or was it, I just curious about the research. Yeah.
Oh yes, of course. I mean, I wanted this story to be in conversation with other stories. And it was important to me to engage with every art form that had touched on these subjects, the history of detention without trial, the leftist movements. And any kind of view that was outside of the mainstream. And sadly, it was possible for me to encounter pretty much all of it because it's such a small body. I mean, I'm grateful it exists. I just wish there were more. So yes, I definitely wanted to see what other people had made of it, the different ways in which they pushed against power, the different ways in which they introduced the official narrative and then dissenting elements. I guess the larger ways in which we find ourselves trying to have a conversation with someone who doesn't want to talk back to us or even acknowledge us. And that's what hegemony feels like. When you have a very defined body of work that feels completely solid, both in terms of nonfiction, what the government narrative is, but also in terms of fiction, what many writers, filmmakers, theatre makers take as unspoken assumptions because they haven't seen any way outside of that. So anyone who did manage to get outside of that bubble, I really wanted to engage with. And yes, I watched, I read, I spoke to everyone I could.
Hi, so I'm wondering if you've observed perhaps any cultural factors at play that may impede or hinder a sense of political empowerment or galvanization among Singaporeans.
Comfort. I mean, Singaporeans are very comfortable, and it's seductive to go, my life is good, so why should I care about the people who aren't? Or why should I listen to the niggling voice inside me that says things could be better? Or that perhaps my prosperity is at the expense of someone else's? When you have a large section of the population that's living well, but also is very busy with work and constantly feels stressed and just a little bit behind, it's very hard then to motivate them to question everything they're given. And it's much easier to just go along with the flow if there's no real strong reason to dissent. Dissent is costly. And the more comfortable you make people, the more they have to sacrifice. So I don't want to say make people uncomfortable, but I hope through my writing to at least discomfort people enough that they think outside the box a little.
Anyone in the back? Okay. Yes, all right. I knew someone would raise their hand.
Since both these books are in English, I was wondering if either of you or both of you could speak to how voices from languages other than English might have been in your heads when you were writing and how you found ways to bring those voices into the works.
Well, as a translator, I'm generally thinking in more than one language anyway. And a lot of the people that I interviewed were Chinese speakers. So I already had their voices in my head. And it was, I mean, there's no real way to convey the multiplicity of Singapore. And I guess I just tried to remember at every juncture that these voices weren't singular and that they weren't necessarily speaking in the grammatical English that I write in. But it's difficult to get all of that down. And I suppose all I could do was try to absorb as much as I could from these different voices, from these different communities and languages and religions and all the rest of that, and at least try and hold that in my head as I wrote, and remind myself, which is quite good when you're from the majority ethnicity in Singapore, as I am, that not everyone is like you. It's not.
Yeah, if I'll add to that, a lot of the research for this book and other work I've done sometimes comes from other languages. I speak Mandarin as well, but not half as good as Jeremy, so I can't translate in the way he does. Reading newspapers in Chinese is already difficult for me, so I read a lot of things in translation. But I do spend a lot of time there, like Jeremy said, thinking about the fact that this person who's speaking or whose account I'm reading is probably nothing like me, and trying to put yourselves literally in their shoes. The other thing also I found useful, like if I can't speak to someone who's older, who is more comfortable in a non-English language, is I talk to their kids who might be my friends or someone who can act as an intermediary. And even in translation, if people are in the room and you're interviewing them and all that, there is a life and a character that you can sort of pick up. And so I guess when I'm very conscious, okay, I'm trying to write this story, even if it's fiction, I've written fiction stories that are about people nothing like me, I'm just kind of like in the room with someone you're interviewing and you're trying to go like, pick up every, like even how you don't know what they're saying literally, but you're like, how's their bodies moving? What's setting off the emotions in them and all those kinds of ethnographic clues. I'm very ethnographic when I write. That is my own trick. Because otherwise, I mean, like even when you're writing about history, I mean, I have written things about what people in the 19th century or so on might have thought or would have behaved, and you're making it up, right? Basically, I wasn't alive then. There's no video records. But you just try and get as close to the heart of what that person might have been like, as much justice as you can do from our vantage point, yeah.
All right.
This question could be for either of you. I'm curious as to whether any left-leaning Singaporeans had joined Jinping's army prior to 1965, perhaps because the histories of both countries were so intertwined that they felt they had a common vested interest. And then after 65, when Singapore became independent, that perhaps that Jinping's cause was no longer relevant to them. So did they leave his army consequently?
Okay, I don't know the history thoroughly, but definitely before 1965, yes, there would have been people who lived in Singapore who were sympathetic to the communist cause or members of the party or who decided, yes, I'm going to join the jungle war, and they would have done so. After 1965, whether they could come back, I highly doubt it because they would.
Yeah, I mean, once you were out, you were pretty much out for good. It was the same with the people who went to China to join the fight, the civil war there. You couldn't come back once you left. Singapore's very unforgiving that way.
I mean, I think they would, for those who went to China, I've heard anecdotally that I think maybe by the 80s or so, they could come back at least for visits by then. But if you were involved with the Malayan Communist Party, I don't think so. I mean, there are people who were detained without trial in the 1987. Primarily, like people affiliated with the Catholic Church and so on, doing social work. A few left the country after they were released and have not been able to come back.
When you say 87, you mean Operation Lalang?
No, 87 is Operation Spectrum in Singapore.
Oh.
I don't know the Lalang history, that's Malaysia, yeah. And there is also definitely people from...
It was Cold Store, yeah, the 50s. There was Operation Cold Store, and then there was Operation Pecha.
Spectrum, right?
That Spectrum, yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely people from from 1987, detained, eventually released. They might have gone overseas. And they are basically stateless, so they can't get a Singapore passport to come back. And perhaps they live in the UK or somewhere where the government of that country allows them to live and they can have a job and so on. But they can't come back at all. Yeah.
I mean, I recommend Tan Pin Pin's film To Singapore with Love, which is basically a series of interviews with political exiles from Singapore.
Thank you.
Another question, this is for Jeremy. Because, most of the novel seems to be set in Singapore, especially the present-day portions of it, but of course a large portion of it is related to Malaysia as well as to China, of course. So I wonder, how do you think of yourself, as a writer writing this novel? Do you think of yourself mainly as a Singaporean writer or as an Asian writer? Whether that category, Asian writer, has any kind of usefulness for you, especially since we're in this space?
I try not to think of myself.
Very healthy.
But my mother is Malaysian, and I spent a good part of my childhood in Malaysia. So I've always felt close to both countries and connected to the histories and cultures of both sides, which helped me a lot when it came to write this. Because Singapore and Malaysia were once the same country, and still share a lot of things in common. And this period of history, particularly, really, you can't talk about one without the other. So it was necessary to try and understand at any one time what the characters thought about whether they. I mean, the more interesting question to me is not how I think of myself, but how they saw themselves. So would this character think of themselves as Singaporean or Malayan, or even a British subject, as you would have been in the 50s? So there are a lot of layers there, and how you identify it and which box you put yourself in, I think says a lot about which tribe you then want to place yourself in.
More questions?
Out of curiosity, how many people here are from Singapore? Cool. Malaysia? Thank you. Just curious.
Last question, I promise. So I wanted to know, how do we kind of deconstruct the sort of cult of personality we have around Lee Kuan Yew? When I first got interested in Singaporean history and politics, it's virtually like the only way you could get into it is through Lee Kuan Yew. You can't separate modern Singapore from Lee Kuan Yew. Essentially, he's everything from Abraham Lincoln to Joseph Stalin. You know, he's the guy who defines the state. And so, you know, I wanted to know, like, so where do we go forward with that? You know, like, are we, if we're going to, let's say, you know, and not me specifically, I'm not Singaporean, but let's say, you know, a political movement does grow or an activist movement does grow, do they have to kind of buy into sort of respectability where they pay credence to this sort of cult of personality? Or should there be a more aggressive attempt to kind of say he wasn't this sort of mythical hero that he's often portrayed in the media and in government, you know, rhetoric?
Guess who isn't mentioned in my book?
He does make a cameo appearance, though.
Not by name. And it was important to me not to let Lee Kuan Yew define the narrative. And I think rather than attacking him or trying to say, no, that narrative is wrong, I'd much rather just go off and make another narrative. And I think that's just what we have to do, find other ways of telling the story. I'm a big believer in choosing my battles. And I think the Lee Kuan Yew myth is so entrenched that it would be very hard to dislodge it. But what you can do is provide different stories and hope that people eventually gravitate to those too.
If I can just show you the cover of the book, and the credit part of it goes to my co-author because he had a conversation with the book designer, and he very much wanted a sort of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club album cover approach. And Mr. Lee is up here. His head is no bigger than anybody else's head. Stamford Raffles' head is here. So they're both there because they did stuff that was important. But we thought it was, yeah, I mean, when Mark spoke to me about this, it's like, yeah, totally, go for this. Like, we thought it was important, like, yeah, they're in the book, because you can't write a history of Singapore. For non-fiction, you cannot completely omit the mention of certain names, Mr. Lee, Mr. Raffles, and so on. But there are a lot of other names that you can also put there that make sense and that make the story more comprehensive or interesting or honest. And those are some ways, I guess, of doing it without, like Jeremy said, being, you know, again, directly headbutting with the myth, I guess.
This is the last round of questions.
In a story that's so kind of entrenched in the eradicated side of history and in oral histories, where do you find that line or that balance between history and fiction?
So I'm translating a Taiwanese novel at the moment by a writer named Lo Yi-chin, and the main character in his novel is called Lo Yi-chin and has his exact family background and does what he does for a living. But also, it has to be fiction, because, for instance, at the end of the first chapter, he beats up a small child. Or at least I hope it's fiction. So when I met Mr. Low, I asked him, just which bits of this novel are your real life and which bits are made up? And he said to me, honestly, I can't remember. And that's kind of the approach I'm going for. I don't want to draw a clear line between history and fiction. So the approach I took was that if I could use the truth, then I would. And if I had to add elements to make the story work, and I had to plant my characters in them, and obviously they're fictional, then I would do that. But I wouldn't make up anything I didn't have to, because the truth is so compelling. And particularly with a period of history that's relatively little known, I wanted to ground this very much in actual events. And so I hope that the past is there, fully fledged, and that my story is just a kind of melody that floats above it.
Okay, thank you all for the great questions and for listening and for coming down this evening. We will draw the session to a close, and if you would like to have a drink or buy some books or eat some kueh, I think
The coconut cakes are here.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Very important. Yeah. Try them. I'm very excited. We will be around for a while if you'd like to chat to Jeremy or me. Thank you all so much.
Yes, thanks everyone.